So next I want to invite Will Files. Like I did say, much like Greg earlier, a good friend, but also a fantastic sound supervisor, sound designer, and re-recording mixer. So welcome. I'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and the kind of things that you work on a day-to-day basis. We can see some of the titles that you've worked on here in front of us now, but I'd love if you could give us a little idea of the kind of things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Um, my day-to-day changes a lot, actually. Some days I'm here in the home studio and I'm doing sound design, which is something that I did some of before quarantine, but these days I'm basically doing all my sound design in the home studio, which is actually not so bad. Kind of miss the camaraderie of being with the team, but it's also nice to be at home.
Yeah.
Then I'll flip between that and mixing. And usually when I'm mixing, I've actually done some mixing here during quarantine at the home studio, but mostly I'm going into Sony or Warner Brothers or Deluxe or Technicolor, one of the bigger stages in town, which actually I'll be doing tomorrow. So we're about to start the final mix for Ghostbusters.
Awesome.
Finally, after being on hiatus for 6 months, basically. But that'll be fun. I'll be, going in and wearing a mask all day mixing, and that's sort of the new normal.
So I think one of the things that's interesting is looking at the titles that you've been working on. There's a real mix of film, streaming, and other formats. How do they differ for you when you're working on them?
They don't differ that much. There's a little bit of an adjustment that you might make based on what the target format is going to be. For example, I mixed a film for Netflix recently, and we decided to mix it in a smaller mixing theater. It's still a theatrical mixing theater, but not sort of the size of like a lot of the mixing theaters that we mix in are somewhere in the order of 200 to 500 seat theater sizes, because normally we're mixing for, if you're doing Venom or something like that, or Star Wars, you're assuming it's going to play in these really big multiplex rooms that have literally hundreds of people, and they have a certain sort of sound characteristics, so we tend to work in those kinds of rooms. For a Netflix film or any other sort of streaming title, it makes sense to still work in a room that's big enough to have multiple creatives in it, multiple mixers and sound editors, and more importantly, potentially multiple clients, that it has a big enough sweet spot that everyone can get some sense of what the mix sounds like, but also balancing that against still hearing the detail that you're going to get in a near field environment. And also sort of the way the dynamics play in a bigger room versus a smaller room. This is something that Ozzy and I have talked about at length in terms of what's the sort of perfect size mixing stage for a streaming product. Because you do have to balance those two things. It's, trying to work in a room that is a little closer to what an average home theater is going to be versus having enough room to do the creative work in a sort of pleasant way for everyone. And of course, that's taken on a whole new factor with COVID, because now we have to make sure that we're all a certain space away from each other and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think, we've talked about this before when you've been in Japan with me, that there's an idea that this is, it makes it more difficult, or it takes a lot more time. So I'm kind of interested, when you start working in these larger formats, what's it offering both in benefits, and what are some of the challenges of it?
You just mean like in terms of immersive in general?
Yeah, just in general, like when you start out the project, how that impacts it as it goes through.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's one of those things where I think everyone assumes that it's much different to mix in Atmos than it is to mix in 5.1 or something like that. But once you have everything set up, once you have the technical side worked out in terms of your mixing template and the recording and of course the room monitoring and all that stuff, you're still just making a lot of the same kind of decisions that you would make in the course of a regular mixing session. So you're still deciding, you know, the relative balance of things and where they're going to be in the room. And of course, now you've got more opportunities to put things in cooler places. But what I've found is that it's kind of like working in the, you know, visual equivalent of like starting your mix in 4K and then mastering down to 2K and then to DVD and to, you know, lower resolutions. Because if you start with a bigger negative, start with a bigger master, then you can kind of go down the funnel in a way that is the creative intent is preserved. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting questions that came up before, that I know that we've talked about before, is starting with that bigger, larger, as you say, like the 4K version or the 8K version or whatever we're doing these days, down to a smaller version. But you've actually had quite good success with the Atmos mix being used for the 7.1, 5.1 and other re-renders as well. So I wondered if you had something to share about that.
Well, that was one of the things that we worked with Dolby on very early on, because we realized that there was this concept that if you started with the Uber mix and then you're able to derive everything from that, that would make the workflow much easier. Because I mean, who really has the time to mix the movie 2 different times? I mean, a lot of the early mixes that we did, like Brave and Star Trek Into Darkness, we started with the 7.1 mix, and then we did an Atmos mix, but then we also did a 5.1 mix, and then we also did a stereo mix.
Sure.
So it's sort of like starting in the middle and going both ways. It doesn't really make sense. So that's one of the things that we worked with Dolby early on about is, okay, how can we give the mixers the control that they need when they're making their down mixes so that the machine can do the vast majority of the work. And I have to say, it's at a point now that I can dial in my settings in such a way that it 99%, the 7.1 and the 5.1 and even the stereo are 99% what I would expect. And then every now and then I might have to go in and tweak something, but that's actually becoming more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, I think it was we were talking another time, and we've talked about you know, there's this sort of a really good partnership with Dolby and Avid, and I think you're talking about working on some of the very early films that were using some differently put together tools, and now that there's a very integrated path between Pro Tools and the renderer and of course our surfaces that support that as well. And I think you summed it up pretty simply, but it makes quite a difference in your ability to work through things quickly.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the name of the game. Especially when you have a backfield full of creatives and they have an idea, they usually want to hear it as fast as possible. And certainly when we started using Atmos, I mean, at least when I started using Atmos, it was super early days we were beta testing it, basically. We were trying to figure out how it was going to work. And we were using, you know, software that was, you know, not released yet, not ready for prime time. But even once the first version was released and we were dealing with the plugin, you know, and how that interfaces with the recorder and sort of injecting the Atmos workflow into the workflows that we were using at that time, which there was a lot more people using large format mixing consoles versus S6 wasn't really a thing when, actually S6 wasn't even around yet when Atmos first came out. So the tools have evolved to a point now where I think most mixers, any mixer who's done at least one Atmos project, I think, is not scared by it anymore. It's really, it's exciting now. It's like, you know, we have a bigger canvas to paint on. And the workflow is established to the point now with all the integration in Pro Tools that it's like not really an issue.
Yeah, I think that's sort of an interesting part. Seeing it develop over the years, that, you know, it's very much part of the day-to-day workflow. There's a couple of actually questions before we jump into some sort of tips I wanted to talk about, but there's a couple of questions about working to different loudness levels between film and television. I know we're going to touch on that with Ozzy in the Netflix session. And I think you mentioned that for Netflix, obviously, there's a different specification that you have to mix to what you would be doing for a film in the theater, and also working in smaller rooms, and about translation into different formats, whether that's going to end up being on a TV or a soundbar. I just wonder if you had a few comments around that area of dealing with. Obviously, there's a lot of creative opportunities, but you have to meet the technical requirements as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can share a couple little kind of tips and tricks that we've figured out along the way. You know, luckily the latest version of the Dolby Atmos production suite has loudness measurement built into it, which makes life a little easier. But it was easy enough to just measure. We would, you know, measure the 5.1 re-render, basically, is how we would do it before. But something that we have been playing around with, me and Mark Patterson, on some of the Netflix stuff that we've done, like Stranger Things and this film that we just mixed, what we'll often do is sort of pick a starting point in terms of what monitoring level we're choosing. And we kind of do it a little bit by, you know, our best guess in terms of what size room we're in. So like, for example, with Stranger Things, we decided to start with at 82 in the monitoring loudness. And we did our first pass, our first day of mixing. We sort of just did a quick pass of the episode, and then at the end of the day, we measured it. Mm-hmm. And we found we were a dB off of spec.
Right.
In fact, we were, if I remember, we were a dB low.
Okay, that's interesting.
So what we did is we turned the, what was it? We turned the volume down a dB, and then we turned the mix up a dB, and we kept it. You know what? Actually, it was the other way around. Anyway, we went it up at 83. So it ended up being the kind of thing where we rely, because at least we're feature film mixers, so we rely more on our ears than mixing to a meter. So that's the trick that we use in terms of how do we still sort of mix the way we're used to mixing, but try to hit this dialogue normalization level, sort of, you know, by feel almost more than by meter. And that's the way we came up to do it. It was like, let's just pick a sort of, you know, ballpark arbitrary number. Let's mix the first pass, let's measure it, and then we can figure out, okay, where do we put the room so that we sort of automatically hit that number? And then sure enough, we put it at 83, and the next episode we hit it just sort of naturally. We hit it almost exactly on the number. So we've done similar things on other projects, and it actually works really well. I mean, obviously, if you're mixing a feature film for a theatrical release, you're always going to want to be at 85.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in that in terms of, even in a small room, if it's calibrated correctly, if Dolby or somebody else has come in and lined the room up correctly, like even my home studio, I always work at 85, because I find that if I don't, when I do take it to a bigger stage, it's just always going to be off.
Right.
So
well,
I
that's
work at 85 for theatrical.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a specific question about LKFS, and I know obviously in theatrical you've got more or less the full scale. It's interesting myself in some of the freelance work I've done. In some ways, I found some of the loudness measurements almost a little freer in that you actually do have a little bit of space for some impact, some sudden, high transient audio. You just have to be a little careful about how large the sound is, or how long it stays at a high level after that. And so I guess that sort of falls into, are you adjusting the way that you're mixing? Are you mixing perhaps slightly less dynamically for something that's going to be streaming in the end?
Well, Ozzy will probably get mad at me for saying this, but at least with Stranger Things, no. Like, Stranger Things is highly dynamic.
Yeah.
Everyone who's seen the show can attest. But that's what works about the Netflix loudness spec, is that it's based on dialogue level.
Yeah.
So it's not really about dynamics. It's about where is that dialogue level at? So as long as you keep your dialogue in a really tight pocket, the audience is not going to be annoyed by some spikes and low, some dynamics in the rest of the mix, because as long as you can hear the dialogue, people don't get upset. That's the thing that makes people annoyed more than anything else, is can I hear the dialogue?
Yeah.
And, then they're chasing it on their remote control.
Well, that's exactly it. Always the dialogue that people are chasing with their remote. So that makes a lot of sense to me as well. So, talking about, I've got one of your sessions here that you were kind enough to send over. It looks like it's a effects Foley background sort of template session, and I wanted to have a quick look at how you organize a few things in there. But I wondered if you, before we jump into that, if you have any sort of general tips for people who are maybe breaking out of stereo or 5.1 or 7.1, and they're now looking to go to an immersive environment such as Atmos.
It kind of depends on how you like to work. I mean, I personally, I like to keep things pretty organized in my sessions, as you can probably see from just the layout of the session itself. I like to keep things simple and clear, and also fairly organized. So sometimes that ends up meaning that I have maybe more pre-dub groups than I need, because I want to keep all my explosions in one pre-dub, and I want to hear the debris in another pre-dub, and I want to hear the bomb whistles in another pre-dub, and I want to be able to set to, when the director says, hey, can I have more debris on that third explosion? It's easy for me to just grab that fader and turn it up. So because of that, even back in the older days, before the 6 came around, when I was mixing on the DFC, the Neve DFC, and I've continued this now in Pro Tools, is I like to organize my pre-dubs to include some objects. So every pre-dub group has a certain number of object tracks allocated within it. And then in the last couple of years, I've also started doing a thing where I will bus the rest of the tracks in that pre-dub group to those same objects, so I can do the object toggle if I want to. That means I have to use a lot more DSP to route everything. So it's a bit of a resource hog, but it's also, I found, just creatively, it's a really nice workflow for me as a mixer, because I can very easily say, okay, here's a bunch of stuff, like here's 6 mono sounds that make up this sound. And if I send all of those to object 1, and I click the object toggle, and then on the object 1 track that's below, that's hard assigned to object 1, I'll actually just make a region group, and I'll pan it on that with literally no audio going on that track, but that's where the pan lives for those 6 tracks that I've automated. So it's a bit of a more virtualized workflow, but for me it works great, because it means that I don't have to worry about if I have more sounds than fit into the 1 or 2 objects that I've allocated for that pre-dub.
Cool. So hopefully everyone can see my Pro Tools screen now. So actually, the way that you have this so tidy is almost deceptive. If we have a look at the system usage, there's something like 500 tracks or somewhere around that sort of number in the session. But you've gone through and you have some places to keep your pictures, guide mixes, then some VCAs. And then you've split all of your buses and your various effects groups out into folders. So it looks like you can kind of see one very large session all from one level.
Yeah, so it's very deceptively simple. But this is how I like to start my day, is with a nice tidy session. And then it means that I can drill down to various things, depending on, okay, I want to do a backgrounds pass. Let me just open up the backgrounds. I want to get into the effects. Let me open up the effects. And you can see within that I've got it set up where there's a VCA followed by a folder with my with the tracks that belong to that pre-dub group.
So yeah, I thought it was interesting. There's a question in here which we can answer actually with this session, but as you mentioned before, you have all your tracks in here, as well as excuse me, as well as assigned to an object which you can flip. You've got object 1 there assigned to the multiple tracks, as you mentioned. But one thing that I've always thought is really interesting about your sessions is the idea of dealing with well, not all of my content or my sound design is immersive to start off with. It might be a mono source or a stereo source, or maybe even some 5.1 material. And I've always found it really interesting looking at your sessions that, for example, just off this first track here, you have these set of 4 effects return, and then also an effects send off to probably the LFE. So I thought that was quite an interesting kind of workflow thing. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so basically, I do, like you said, I tend to, all the material that I get as a mixer, and even the material I cut, it tends to be mono and stereo. And rarely 5.1 or even more rarely 7.1. So the trick is to, how do you take that material and turn it into a big immersive Atmos mix? And one of the ways that I do that is I use stereo sends from every track, and they return to stereo reverb. So stereo in, stereo out. So the reason I use stereo sends versus mono sends is I found that especially if you have stereo source material, that it really does have a wider, nicer sound to it. So that's why I use stereo in. And then the reason I use stereo out is that I like having the ability to still pan things just with a regular panner. I do use spanner quite a bit, and occasionally I'll use I'll add some kind of a fancier 5.1 reverb if I want some specific effect that I want to use the whole 5.1 space. Like occasionally I'll use Revibe or Phoenix or one of those things that can do a true 5.1. But a lot of times, as you can see, these are all stereo returns. So the way I have it set up is that one stereo send feeds 2 stereo returns, and by default those are panned front and rear, and they're panned sort of a little bit, as you can see there, like a little bit in, towed a little bit in the front, and they're panned halfway between the sides and the rear and the back. And what's cool about this is then I can do I can actually put 2 different settings on those 2 reverbs. So if I wanted to do something like something really exotic, like a cave reverb or something, I could do like a medium chamber in the front part, and then I could do like a big echo tail, some kind of weird fluttery tail in the rear, so you get this like kind of cool multi-dimensional thing. Or sometimes, as you'll probably see, like if you open up the Effects Reverb 1 reverb there, it's just a room. It's just like a kitchen or something, right? Yeah. And so then on the 1B return, which is the rear, that's the same kitchen, but it has a little increased time and a little increased size, and it has a little pre-delay on it. And so it's the same impulse response, it's the same space, but it's just a little bigger and it's a little delayed from the front. So again, you get what feels like a sort of very natural extension of what's in the front channels, but in the rear and separated a little bit. So you get this kind of multi-dimensional thing. And what's cool too is if you wanted to bus any of these things to a 712 bus or even to a stereo object and put it up on the ceiling or do whatever you wanted to, it's very easy to do that because they're just stereo tracks. Yeah. Once you get into 5.1 or anything above stereo, it gets a little more complicated in terms of your busing. So I tend to use that only for kind of special stuff.
Awesome. And there was another question we can actually answer. Someone was asking, how do you make sure that you're adhering to some of the specifications? Do you have a peak limiter on some of your masters? And actually, we can see that right here on these bus masters as well as some of the object masters. You actually have a peak limiter there just to make sure you catch anything, I guess, at that final stage before it goes out.
Yeah, I like to have a limiter on my tracks, and I also like to use, as you can see, a channel strip before that, so that my my main bus, excuse me, my main bus is getting filtered at about 20 hertz, so that nothing below 20 hertz is getting out to the main channels, because chances are you're not hearing anything in the main channels, I mean, at least in a mixing theater, below 30 hertz. But some home theater systems are crossed over to subwoofers on the main channels, and so they'll go all the way down to, you know, whatever the sub can do. So at least, you know, let's say 20 hertz. So you might be getting all this subsonic stuff happening in your main channels that you never knew about, especially if you're using synthesized sounds. And then if you flip that channel strip over to the LFE, you'll see that it's also doing the LFE filtration at 120 hertz to make sure that there's nothing above that that's, you know, because sometimes you hope that all the subwoofers are filtered, but you can't really count on it. So these master faders are kind of my fail-safe.
Yeah.
You, generally speaking, it's probably a good idea to put a limiter on your outputs. Some QC vendors will bounce things if there's actual clipping, and having a little limiter sitting right at 0.1 dB probably isn't going to change the sound of the mix that much. It does change it a little bit, but generally speaking, it's just, you know, it's fairly transparent.
Yeah.
And then, you know, in the case of something like Stranger Things, where we're mixing for a release spec that's a little bit less forgiving, there's a negative 2 dB limit on that. And so what Netflix recommends is to set your limiter at negative 2.3 dB just to give yourself a little wiggle room there, because some limiters, like the Pro limiter, is actually very good at hitting the number exactly, but not every limiter is quite as good about hitting that number. And the reason, Ozzy can probably talk about this and maybe verify if my theory is right or not, but my assumption is that there's that limit is there, the negative 2 dB is there so that Netflix can, if you're a little bit off spec, Netflix can make that adjustment in their pipeline without clipping your mix.
Yeah, understood. So I think looking at your session, that would probably give people, you know, a lot of good hints about how to set up and get ready. But one of the great things is that we'll touch on with Ozzy, that actually some of the projects that you've worked on are actually available as open source to download. And some of the things that you've got set up in your session here are also echoed in those mix and master sessions that are available. So we're going to touch on that with Ozzy in the next session. So
Yeah.
we're just about out of time on the session. There's just a couple of questions which I thought I would grab if I could. How do you control the parts of the mix that are very low and suddenly jump? Do you use limiters or some technique specifically for that?
Compression's always a good thing for that kind of problem. Transient shapers are also very useful for that kind of thing. Transients are often the thing that can make something sound kind of harsh and edgy. You know, ticky sounds, those kinds of things. If you look at them on the waveform, they're very tall compared to the rest of the sound. You know, something like Foley even, if you turn it down to the point where it's sitting well in the mix, that transient might still be poking out in a way that actually sounds like a digital tick. So that's something that I use a lot on my Foley tracks, and even on like ADR tracks and things like that, I'll use a transient shaper. Yeah. But yeah, compression limiting, that's always your friend. As you know, Daniel, I'm a big fan of multi-band compression.
Multi-band. Yeah, I was going to say, I know that we've talked about that quite a bit, just making sure that you control the harshness of the high end. And leave the sort of the power for the mids and lows to push through and give you that big feeling.
Yeah, because that's the you know, it's the mids and low mids that or the lows and low mids that make things feel big, obviously, and they also tend to be the frequencies that are the least annoying to the ear.
Yeah.
You know, it's all the dialogue frequencies. You know, everything from, let's say, 1K to 8K that tend to be the most annoying to our ears, and actually even above that, like I've found with sound effects and with dialogue, there's actually not much useful stuff above like 10K. Like a lot of the stuff that's above 10K tends to just be annoying for no good reason, especially on cinematic horn speakers that maybe don't have the best resolution in those higher frequencies, so you get a lot more distortion.
Yeah.
When you're listening at home or on studio monitors, it's not going to be quite as apparent. So what I tend to do is take a lot of frequencies out below 10K, and leave that for the music, because the music has all this nice air, and the background sometimes can have that kind of thing too. But a lot of times there's sounds in the backgrounds that you don't want that are up high, like whistles and hums and that kind of thing.
Cool. I think we're pretty much out of time. There's just one super quick question that sort of pertains to you talking about your different filtering on your groups before. And just one final question from someone on LinkedIn. Do you actually put a sub filter on your final output to make sure nothing too awry is happening in the very low end?
I don't filter the bottom end of the LFE track, if that's what the question is.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I know some people do, but I don't, because I like to live on a little bit. But I do do a low pass filter, but I don't do a high pass filter on the LFE.
Understood. Elaborate a little bit on your reverb placement for Atmos. Are these reverbs going to a bed, or do you end up treating them as objects? Do you like having some reverb in the ceiling? And I love your tidy session. Yes, I love your tidy session too.
Me too. It's the only way I can kind of keep my head on straight in a big complicated session, is to try to keep it organized. Yeah, so generally speaking, my reverbs do go to the bed. I have on occasion put reverbs on the ceiling. I would say that generally speaking, when I want to do something really exotic with the reverb, like put it in an object, put it on the ceiling, do something kind of wacky, I will often audio suite some reverb and put that into an object and pan that. And sometimes I do a trick where if it's a really quiet scene and I have something very specific panning through the room, like I did this a lot in The Invisible Man. It's very quiet, and you might hear just one single sound, maybe a voice or maybe footsteps or something moving around the room. I will take the sound, the dry signal, and I'll print a audio suite reverb that goes behind it, and I'll put them in two separate objects that I'll basically pan the dry signal, and then I'll copy that pan to the wet signal, and then I'll put a little bit of additional size on the reverb, the wet sound. So you basically have like a halo that tracks behind whatever the dry sound is. So you get this feeling like it sort of blends between the speakers a little more nicely, and it just feels a little more natural to me. And then sometimes I'll also put some of the bed reverb on that dry sound, so it also has a three-dimensional sound to it.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Will. I know we could talk all day. So thanks for your time, and I hope we get another chance to talk in person soon, in Japan or somewhere else in Asia Pacific, as soon as we can.
I can't wait to sit on, I can't believe I'm saying this, I can't wait to sit on a plane for 11 hours.
No, I'm looking forward to having you back, and thanks very much for your time.